recording, so I'll like please to ask everyone not to open their microphone with the exception of Professor Balland from now on. And actually, it's a very big pleasure to have Professor Balland here in our second webinar part of the Innovation in the Regional Concepts webinar series. So in the name of the Innovation Working Group, it's a great pleasure to have Professor Balland, and I also would like to thank Igor for being so helpful with the organizing this webinar. And so thank you so much. And then Igor would like to introduce Professor Balland. Before that, I'll just say some brief words about how we are going to organize this webinar. So the webinar will consist on about 35 to 40 minutes of presentation. And actually, as Professor Balland mentioned, anyone could stop him with your microphone and ask clarification questions during the presentation. And after the presentation finishes, we're going to have around 20 minutes for questions and answers. So if you have any question, please, you can open your microphone, or you can either write here the question in the chat and we can read it for you, so everyone can be contemplated. And if there are too many questions, we're going to organize a queue and people actually, everyone's be contemplated in asking questions. So thank you, and Igor, whenever you want us.
So thank you everyone for being here. As Danilo said, this webinar is part of the webinar series Innovation in a Regional Context. And the series aims to discuss the role of space in the innovation process, as well as the role of the innovation at the urban and regional development, disparities and resilience. And it has been jointly organized by the Urban and Regional Economics Working Group and the Economics of Innovation. Therefore, I would like to thank very much the fellows of the Economic of Innovation Working Groups, especially the organizer Danilo, that has working closely with us to make it happen. Thank you very much, Danilo. And to us, it's a great pleasure to have today with us Professor Pierre-Alexander Balland. Professor Balland is Assistant Professor of Economic Geography at Utrecht University. And he previously held positions at the University of California, Los Angeles, the University of Lund, and the University of Toulouse. His research focuses on geography of innovation, networks, and sustainable transitions. He's particularly interested in the persistent role of the geographical proximity for economic development in the digital age. He will give the talk Knowledge Complexity and Spatial Inequality. And we are very thank you, Professor. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And the microphone is totally yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Igor, for this very kind introduction. Thank you, Danilo, for the organization of this webinar. I must say that I'm very, very pleased to see this type of initiatives. I know it's a lot of work, and I hope it will really leverage a lot of enthusiasm in this community, because I can see traveling to different conferences that we have a very, very big community working on topics related to economic geography and economics of innovation. And I think this webinar really have the potential to bring us a bit more together, which is what we need. So I really want to thank the two of you and all the people that have been involved in this initiative. So thank you so much. And I'm very delighted to have in front of me a crowd, a virtual crowd of young economic geographers that want to learn more about this topic. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to present a paper which is very much still work in progress, but we hope to have like a really final version by the end of this year. And we've been working on this paper now for about 2 years, so it has been a lot of work, and joint work, I must say, with David Rigby from the University of California in Los Angeles, Sergio Petraglia, who is now at LSE, Mathieu Stein from Utrecht University, Christian Jara Figueroa, and Cesar Hidalgo from MIT. So it's a partnership where we try to do something at the end extremely simple. We want to look at the relationship between knowledge complexity and spatial inequality, because we believe that one of the most important topics today is not only about understanding why some cities or some region are innovative or create knowledge, but really why some create much more than others, and try to understand why there is this huge gap between these superstar cities that have everything and the rest of the world that looks like, you know, is lagging behind a little bit, and maybe is lagging behind more and more. So we want to study how this gap has been widening over the past maybe 200 years in this paper. And what I want to put forward, which is something which is not always very much discussed in the literature, but what I really want to put forward in this paper is the role of knowledge complexity. So I want to discuss, and I want to challenge you as well, who are listening to this talk now, to really think about what can create, what can be the very deep forces behind this spatial inequality between these superstar cities that have everything and the rest of the world. And what I want to put forward is really the role of knowledge complexity, or to put it differently, of technological progress. So before I really start to go into the meat of the paper, and also if you have any question, please open your mic and just, you know, shoot any question, especially for clarification. I want to make sure that the message really comes across. So there are like three main key components in this talk that I really want to make very clear. The first one, I'm going to talk about scaling. So when I'm going to refer to spatial inequality, I'm really going to talk about the spatial concentration of knowledge, technologies, scientific outputs, industries, occupation in large cities. So I'm going to go through the math a bit later on, but for now, just make sure that you understand the intuition. Scaling is about really the fact that some activities concentrate in large cities. So it's not only a spatial concentration indicator, such as the Hoover Gini or the Krugman Index, where we just look at the concentration anywhere. We look at the concentration of some activities in large cities. Now, later on, we're going to talk about knowledge complexity, which you can just summarize as the difficulty to recombine knowledge, to create something new. How difficult is it to recombine different pieces of knowledge to come up with something new, to something with something novel. And then I'm going to use mainly, like, my main tool in this paper will be an historical patent data set that we call ISPAT, and that basically gives you information on virtually any patent that you can find in the US from 1790 to 2010. And that's what we use to really look at the relationship between complexity and scaling. And this data set is available for free. So if you're interested, I will show you later the link if you want to play with it, because there are many questions that we are not able to tackle. And this this data set is really for you to play with if you're interested. Okay, so just like to start with some motivation, if you basically take a map, and that's really the root of spatial inequality, if you really take a map, and basically anyone working in economic geography starts with this kind of first representation of the world. If you take a map and you look at where population is distributed, you see that it's very uneven. So you have, if you look here at population density, you have like the top 40 US metro that account for like half of the US population. So there is this really, you know, this spikiness of the world. And that's something that I really enjoy. I really like to study the spikiness of the world, because we had, you know, in 2005 and 2005, especially with the internet, this crazy idea that geography was not relevant anymore. And I'm on the side of the scholars that basically believe that geography might be more important than ever in a knowledge-based economy. So if you look at the distribution of the population in the world, you see these pockets of people that are really concentrated. And that, of course, we all agree on that. Now, if you look at innovation, you see that these spikes, they are much more sharp. So they tend to concentrate even more. So that's like really the basic of the geography of innovation. And if you think, for instance, about of the top 10 cities in the world, they only account for 2% of the population, but 24% of the world's patent application. So there is an incredible concentration of innovation in the world, and that's kind of the kind of topics we want to understand. We want to understand why we find this concentration. Why do we find this concentration in cities? Is this gap between cities and the rest of the world widening? And basically, what will be the future of the world? The future of the world as a playground for mega cities that have everything, So I want to try to point out into this kind of direction. So I'm going to try to reach two objectives in this presentation. The first one, I want to give you some intuition of some theoretical reason why we believe that the growth of knowledge complexity is basically a driver of spatial inequality. So that I want to discuss, and I want you also to challenge me if you want and ask me a question about that, because I want to give you basically some theoretical pieces of knowledge to really try to understand this mechanism, how we can move from the fact that knowledge complexity is growing, that we have technological progress, and how does that end up into a widening spatial inequality. And the second one, I want to test a couple of these ideas that I will develop in the theoretical framework with an historical analysis, looking at the geography of invention in the United States, starting in 1790. So if I basically reach these two objectives in the next half an hour, then I'm very happy. So just to position my vision of cities in this context and to make it extremely simple, cities are devices that allow us to communicate very quickly, to share ideas, to exchange knowledge, and this geographical proximity really reduces the cost of moving goods, people, and ideas. And it's the three main externalities, agglomeration externalities. The only thing is that today, the difficulty of moving ideas is basically dependent on the complexity of these ideas. And geographical proximity is even more important because our 21st century economy is very much based on ideas. So this is really the key function of cities. Now, you're going to ask me, how do we move from knowledge complexity on one side that doesn't seem to have any kind of spatial component and spatial inequality? So the first thing we're gonna have to agree on this. There is a growth of knowledge complexity. But basically, we live in an area where we have something called technological progress. So the knowledge that we create today is more complex than the knowledge we created 2 days ago, or 100 years ago, or 1,000 years ago. Okay, so there is more and more complexity of knowledge, and that's not something I want to explain. I want to take it as an assumption. I want to take it as given. And if you agree on that, knowledge is becoming more and more complex. It's more and more difficult to create knowledge. You need more and more resources, financial resources, or time, or however you want to measure it. Then we can start and think about a direct consequence of this growth of knowledge complexity, which is the specialization of individuals. So as knowledge becomes more complex, you really have to narrow down your expertise and to really specialize in a finer and finer branch of knowledge. So if you narrow down this expertise, you end up with a world of experts, a world of very specialized individuals. And you cannot be a jack of all trades. You cannot basically master every topic, because the more we learn about a topic, the more you have to learn about it before you can make a contribution. So by definition, when you have a growth of knowledge complexity, when you have technological progress, you specialize. Think about the Leonardo da Vinci of the 1500, the 16th century, the Renaissance in Florence, that were able to master really different type of branches of knowledge. That doesn't exist anymore. We have specialists because of the growth of knowledge complexity, which really implies that we have this need for interaction of networks. We have this need for networks because if you have a lot of different individuals that are very, very specialized, then you need to recombine to create something new. They need to reassemble their specificities to come up with something new. And that generates absolutely enormous distance-based costs. Because what we do right now is basically having this discussion, for now, a one-way discussion where I just diffuse a couple of ideas, and then hopefully during the last 20 minutes, there's going to be a feedback process. We're going to build something. We're going to be able to exchange ideas and knowledge. But by definition, it has to be extremely simple. We have to simplify it, because if we make it too complex, then we won't be able to understand each other. And that's something that can only be solved with geographical proximity, with a lot of interaction. And there is something to be understood between how large these networks of people that bring different pieces of knowledge together, how large these networks are, and how costly it is to basically maintain this network in terms of resources, in terms of time, however you define it. So when you have this very large network, the cost in terms of interaction increase non-linearly with the number of people. So basically, if you think about the number of links you need when you have a team of 10 people, the maximum number of links would be roughly 10 squared, so 100. Now, if you think about a team of like 1,000 or 10,000, then you always have to square this number. So you have this nonlinear distance-based cost. And geography gives you a device to really reduce this cost. And that gives rise to these knowledge hubs, these cities that basically are able to accommodate extremely tiny specialized individuals that can recombine knowledge together. And that's something which is very, very difficult to create somewhere else in another setting without this geography. So these cities are these devices that allow us to basically interact and exchange at a very large scale. And here this idea of scaling is extremely important, which might generate knowledge complexity again. And so you have this kind of circle that's going from knowledge complexity to the growth of cities. So this is the theoretical framework to make it very simple. Now, to test this idea, we're going to use a couple of tools. The first one is we're going to use some data. We're going to use patent data. So I don't know if you're familiar with patent documents, but it's basically a wonderful resource for us working on economics of innovation or economic geography, because you have two extremely important information. The first one, you know exactly where the patent has been developed, because you have the inventor address. So this is very useful information for us. The second one is you have extremely fine-grained information on the type of technology that have been developed, because you should be able, just by reading the patent, if you're an expert in the field, you should be able to reproduce the technology. So you have a lot of information about a specific technology. And think about the fact that now in the US, we have a total of about 7 million patent documents. So usually most of the study that use patents started in 1975 till 2010, because this is when most of the patent offices in the world really started to record electronically patents, to digitalize patents in 1975. But of course, if you know a little bit the history of the IP in the US, the very, very first patent was granted in 1790, a very long time ago. So you have this gap between 1790 and 1975, where usually you don't really have information, because sure, you can find the patents, but they are like physical documents. And so it's extremely difficult to do research with this, because you need to scan them, you need to extract the information. It's really a pain, and usually, well, actually nobody ever managed to do that in a research setting. Until Google made these documents available as OCR, so like a bag of text, if you want, a bag of words. For each patent, you have a bag of words. And what we did with Sergio Petraglia and David Rigby, we created a data set where we went and extracted this different information and organized a data set with different columns and variables that are very, very easy. Oh, I don't know why it's moving. Okay, which is very easy to use now. So if you follow this link here, then you will be able to read the document that explain everything about the methodology, because I can tell you it was really a lot of work. We had some machine learning algorithms playing here to extract information and organize the data the way we want it. And you can basically use this data set if you want. So what's important here is that you have about 7 million unique patent documents where you have information to play with, going from 1790 to 2016. And you have, which is very, very important, the geography of these patents. What we give is the county level. So you have around 4,000 counties in the US. So you have the geography of these patents at the county level. And then you also have, which is very, very important, their technological classes. So basically, in which tiny area of the technological space is this patent making a contribution, making a claim, making a novelty. And this is very finely disaggregated, because you have about, at the most, the final level, you have around 150,000 different subclasses, so sub-technologies. So imagine a very, very specific technology related to nucleic acids and proteins, so nanotechnology. You know exactly the technological area of this patent. So you can do a lot of interesting work with this. What we do, we look at scaling in cities. So we look at how much patenting activities tend to concentrate in large cities. So if you can see here, you have a cloud of different points. Each point is a city. You have here Amarillo in Texas. You have here Riverside, San Jose. So like the Silicon Valley is here up in terms of y-axis, and you have on the x-axis you have like the population of cities. So big cities are on the right here, and here you see the log of patents. So how much a city produces in terms of patents, so innovation output or invention output, if you prefer. And if there is just like a proportional scaling, so no scaling at all, if it's just proportional, so if the production of patents is proportional to the size of the city, then you get a beta of 1, so you don't have any scaling. Now what you observe is in reality you have something we call superlinear scaling. So the bigger the city, the more the city produces patents, even compared to its size. So if there is no scaling at all, if a city gets bigger, grows from 1 people to 100, 1 person to 100 people, and there is no scaling, then the production of patent will grow from 1 to 100. There is no scaling, it's purely proportional. The city produces more patent just because it's bigger, but it's just proportional to the size of the city. When you have a beta of 1.4, more or less, the scaling is absolutely enormous, because when a city grows from 1 person to 100 people, then the production of patent explodes from 1 to 600. That's what this scaling means. And this is what we observe. And this is what the literature is telling you. The literature is telling you that knowledge scales in cities. So that's what we know. Now, we looked at scaling back in time, and we observed that back in 1890, the scaling was much, much lower. So there was already a little bit of scaling, but much lower. Okay. If you compute the scaling exponent over time, we see that there is basically before 1870, there were no real big advantage of being in a city. So there were not, at this time, the great urban advantage didn't really exist, because we had a scaling around 1. If I would put the standard errors here, you will see that we are very much around 1. You might even argue that in 1840, it might be a disadvantage of being in a large city to produce patents. But you see that over time, there's really a growth in terms of this scaling exponent. So like the advantage of being located in a great city, in a big city, is getting bigger and bigger over time. That's what we compute. Now, if you decompose by technology, which is much more interesting, you see that the distribution of some basic technologies like materials processing and handling, basic technologies, is kind of uniformly distributed. Well, if you take something like semicon device, you see this huge spikiness. So now I'm going to move into something else, which is not only the great urban advantage really increased, but there is also there are some sharp differences between technologies in terms of how important it is to be located in a large city. So now if you look at the scaling by technologies, so you decompose and you run the same regression to get your beta exponent, but by technology with different sample, one for communication, one for computer, one for pipe and joints. This is more or less the scaling exponent that you get from the last decade, in 2000, 2010. So you see number 1, communication, number 2, computer, hardware and software, number 3, drugs. If you go down at the bottom of the list, you get agriculture, food and textile, earth, working and wealth, and agriculture, husbandry, food. So you see that basically the very, let's say, intuitively complex technologies that tend to scale more. But it's intuitive, okay? If you look here, you see that there is a kind of order that comes out of your analysis, but you have to measure this complexity. So now I want to move to the question of how to measure knowledge complexity. So I'm going to start with my favorite way of measuring complexity, which is the NK model. And if you're a scholar in complex systems, you heard about the NK model by Kaufman, and a very famous model in biology. And just let me try to summarize very, very quickly. What you do here, you want to first measure the complexity of each patent, okay? And the complexity of a patent depends on 2 things. The first one, that's going to be your N, and it's going to be the number of subclasses, and we have 150,000 subclasses. Number of subclasses that will be combined on a single patent. So how many pieces of puzzle, how many letters of Scrabble do you find on a given patent? And you're going to divide this n by k, which is basically how easy it is to recombine them by looking at how often they've been recombined in the past, knowing that if two pieces of knowledge are very, very often recombined together, maybe it's not very difficult to do that, recombine them. But if you're going to recombine a lot of different pieces, and if these different pieces haven't really been recombined together in the past, then you're going to go up in terms of complexity in our index. Okay, I hope it's clear. And then we reaggregate, of course, by broader categories. Now, there is also another method that's called the method of reflection that we use with David, and it was developed by Cesar Hidalgo and Ricardo Hausmann, and you can read about it. But the main drawback of this method that I actually use often, and I think is extremely good, but the main drawback of this method, it's based on geography in itself. The reason why we use this NK here is because we don't want a geography, because if the geography is already an input to measure the complexity of something, then you cannot really look at its geography again, because there is a kind of endogeneity by construction. So here, in this NK, there is no geography a priori. Okay, there is no geography, just how often different pieces of knowledge are combined together, and how many of these pieces do you find in a single pattern. Okay, I hope it's clear, at least the intuition. And what we observe, and that's really it was really the eureka moment of our team when we found this, is that we have a very strong and robust relationship between knowledge complexity of technologies and their spatial concentration in large cities. So basically, the complex technologies, let's say drugs and biotech, computer here, semicon, and cities cloud here, the complex technologies, they tend to scale. They tend to be found in big cities. The non-complex one, think about mechanical, transportation, earth, working and well, they do not scale. They still scale, but they scale much, much less. They tend not to be found in large cities compared to other technologies. So we like this result very much. And because of the very general journal in which we want to publish this paper, we also wanted to see if it holds using different data sets. So what we did, we also looked at industries. So not patents here, but industries. And for complexity, so spatial concentration is still our scaling exponents, and so it's exactly the same. But here for knowledge complexity, we use, in this case, the share of STEM worker, and STEM workers, science, technology, engineers, and mathematics occupation. And what we see is almost, again, a linear relationship between the complexity, the knowledge complexity of an industry, and how likely you are to find this industry in a large city. Now we look at publication, so scientific publication. In this case, again, spatial concentration here is still a scaling exponent. And on the x-axis, we look at the mean number of authors per paper. And we combine the data set of Koen Franken and Brian Uzzi. And we again have almost a linear relationship between, let's say, the complexity to put together different pieces of knowledge in and produce a new publication, and how they scale, how much they scale in space. Now, if you look at occupation, this is also the same. Again, same story. In this case, we compute the mean years of schooling for a specific occupation. And again, the scaling exponent here, and you have again a relationship, a strong relationship between complexity and scaling. Our friends from Brazil will also be happy to hear that we also use Data Viva, and we also look at scaling of industries and occupation in Brazil, and we find the same results. I also use French data sets. I use different type of data sets, German one, and we always found this relationship. So what we really want, and that's going to be the takeaway message number one, what we really want to document in this paper, and we want to build up the data as much as possible to show that this is a feature of the world. This is a feature of the world in which we see a strong relationship between the complexity of an economic activity and how often it will be that you will find this economic activity in a large city. Now, if you look at scaling and different technological paradigms, so now I go back in time, because for now we're just talking about the last decade, and if you look at the ranking of different technologies, over time, what you see, for instance, in black, you're going to have in black your mechanical technologies. You see they were the most complex back in the day, and now they are falling in terms of scaling. So you were able to find them in cities first, and now they are going into the periphery if you want. And this is very interesting. I don't have enough time to go very much in detail, but there is a fantastic story to tell, and we tell the story in the paper in terms of technological paradigm. So this shift, this massive shift, if you know a little bit of economic history and the history of technology, this massive shift between mechanical and electrical and electronic. And what you see here, which is absolutely wonderful, unfortunately, you don't see on the screen, I think, the decade, but you will have to believe me that it's like 1870 when they first started at MIT, an electrical engineering class in MIT, and that was really a revolution, 1870 till 1920, a revolution where electrical and electronic really took off. Then you see that scaling is also related to this taking off of the technology. So you have first mechanical that really, that scales, but it's still like in a plateau here. Then in 1870, we have a second, a new technological revolution where you have this electrical revolution here that takes off. And not only it takes off in terms of, you see that in the documents, but you also see that in geography. So it's taking off, meaning that as the technology develops, you will find the technology more and more in cities. And then there is a kind of plateau here. And what you see in 1970, now it's the turn of computers and communication. So the story you get from the history of science and technology and the geographical location of this technology is extremely consistent. So you really have a pure reflection of where you find the technology. So when the technology is doing really well, is not maturing yet, you find the technology in cities. When the technology starts to mature, it's getting, if you want, a little bit obsolete, it leaves the city. So you have this very like one-to-one relationship between, if you want, the technological complexity or how hot a technology is and its location in a big city. Now, if you look at the complexity of these different big technologies, it's also related to scaling. Okay, so now I'm moving to the end of my presentation because I see I have 3 minutes, so I want to conclude, so I leave a lot of time for discussion. What is the takeaway message here of this paper? The first thing what we want to document is knowledge complexity drives spatial inequality. That's the first thing I want to put forward. Then the urban advantage, so its scaling, has continuously increased over the past 200 years. So you have this great urban advantage as becoming more and more important. So the gap, if you want, between the big cities and the rest of the world is really widening. Okay, and this is a very important message. And then that scaling really reflects knowledge complexity. So most complex technologies, industries, scientific fields, and occupation, they tend to scale the most. So not only cities get more of the production of technology or industries, but they also get the most complex. And when a technology starts to get a little bit obsolete, then you see a technology leaving the cities. So these cities are really getting the best part of the cake. Not only the bigger one, but also the one that will generate the most economic benefits. Now, this is not in the paper, but that's like a question. So is it just the beginning of the great spatial divide we start to observe? And when I mean great spatial divide, I can really go as far as claiming that this economic spatial divide that we observe is really behind political events like Trump in the US, like Brexit recently on the European side. And so there are some very, very strong implication of this great spatial divide between these big cities that tend to have everything, jobs and wealth, and the rest of the world that might be lagging behind more and more. The gap might be widening. So the big question is just the beginning of the great spatial divide. Because something I also want to mention is another way to look at the complexity of the world and the economy is how this economy is integrated. So basically what will happen, or that would be my prediction, but what will happen with a more integrated economic union in Europe, a more integrated European Union, which is something I would be in favor of, obviously. And for instance, with the same constitution, a similar constitution, will be this widening gap. So to me, that's really a reflection of the complexity of society at large. Right now, I'm talking about some economic activities, but the way population, the world population, is interconnected, and that allows you for this specialization of individuals, is directly impacting this spatial divide we observe. So you can already think about the next 20 or 50 years as a world of big cities, in which big cities have everything. And I'm not saying it's a good thing or it's a bad thing. I'm saying we have to recognize it, and we have to act upon this constatation, because cities are getting more and more also this island of good governance, because cities are much easier to manage than countries. So you have this fading of nations, and you have this emergence of cities with being like this center of economic power, of political power, of social order. And this, to me, this connection between technological progress and complexity and spatial divides, spatial inequality, really imply that we are just starting to begin to observe this great spatial divide. It's going to get worse. That would be my implication if you believe the story between complexity and scaling. Now, a very important question, if you follow me on this argument, is how to make sure that policy, like the smart specialization strategy, won't increase this great spatial divide. Because if you know a bit of this innovation policy in Europe, it also tends to put even more power and advantages in the hands of the winning cities, of these super hot, high-tech hotbeds. So we have to be careful, and I think we really have to very seriously start to integrate this question of spatial inequality into our discussion and our different innovation policy. All right, and that's it for me. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm all yours for questions from now
on. Thank you very much, Professor Balland. It was a very, very interesting presentation. Actually, I would like to highlight that we have a very high number of attendees in this webinar, so we are all very happy about it. And so if anyone wants to ask a question, you can either open your microphone or write it here in the chat, and we can actually read it. So Igor, do we want to say anything about the question and answer as well?
I want to thank Professor Balland to the brilliant presentation. We enjoyed it very much. And let's open to questions. I guess we have one questions of Sir Rafael. He wrote on the chat, but Rafael, do you want to do it aloud, or it's a question about Professor control of if Professor control the variables for R&D capacities, public or private, related to the city size.
Okay, that was the question?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, and do you can you see me right away?
Yeah. Yes, we can. Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Do you control for R&D capacities? Okay. So in this case, no, we don't control, because that's not our goal in this first step. Okay. This first step is really to show this relationship, and the fact that R&D. So first of all, we don't have R&D spending decomposed at such a finer grain level, and this is not our goal here. Our goal is just to provide a description of the world, and to show that this feature holds regardless of the type of industry, occupation, or technology that you have. And that's a question that always pops up. And because of the journal that we're aiming for right now, this is not important, because we want to provide a description, we want to show a feature of the world, and we want to provide a suggestion for what can explain this. But if you want, you could also argue that R&D spending might also be a proxy for complexity. So if you will have R&D spending in the x-axis, you will probably also see this relationship with complexity, between complexity measured with R&D spending and spatial concentration in big cities. So to me, that's also a way to measure, if you want, to measure complexity. And now thinking about it, that's what we do with some data sets. We also have, with a specific data set, we have R&D spending, and you also observe this, this scaling. So it's not already something to be very clear. We don't try to, we don't want to prove really directly a causal relationship. That's going to be a next step. Okay, so in next step, we want to be able to decompose and try to open this black box, this relationship here that we talk about. So right now it's a black box, and that's exactly our point. We want to show this feature and we want to open it in another paper.
Thank you, Professor. We have here a question from Woody. What about the negative consequence of spatial inequality as segregated networks that generate herding effects, elite captures, and etc.?
Yes. So my research is not about this. Okay, it's more like a starting point. So I absolutely believe in this negative effects, absolutely, and that's a motivation for me. It's a motivation trying to understand why we observe this spatial inequality. Okay, so that's the motivation. So I believe there are extremely strong negative effects. One of them can be also, I was mentioning this political consequences as well, where you have part of the population that might feel left out of these economic gains. So these economic gains that are absolutely obvious when you have technological progress and international trade, they are average economic gains. The problem is that they are not fairly and equitably shared. So that's exactly the issue. And to me, that's really a starting point to try to understand what can be driving this wave of spatial inequality.
Someone has a question.
Frederico has one.
Okay.
Have you done another economic approach to see the pattern of time? Because I was thinking that your results that the scale is increasing over time are related to path dependence more than in time is increasing the relationship. I would think that the cost of working is diverse, spatial place to build a new technology is decreasing over time more than in other sectors.
Okay, I'm not entirely sure that I understood the question. So feel free to rephrase if I'm not fully answering your question, okay, Federico? So the way I understand your question is that there is a path-dependent mechanism, so a kind of a feedback, a kind of loop where the more you produce some knowledge somewhere, the more you are likely to produce new knowledge based on that. So you're kind of creating a kind of snowball of knowledge. Yes. So that's something. It's a very good question, and that's something we absolutely tackle in different work. Based on diversification and relatedness. So I don't know if you're familiar with this type of work, diversification and relatedness, but we really see this path-dependent mechanism. So you put different pieces of knowledge somewhere, they tend to grow, new pieces of knowledge tend to grow out of this knowledge, and it also tend to relocate in the same area. So absolutely, that's something we already document in different papers, and I'm totally with you on this one. So this path-dependent mechanism is also an issue and also leads to this great spatial inequality, absolutely. Now, there is another type of sorting effect that we observe going back in time, is that the most complex knowledge remains in the city, and the least complex knowledge, or like you might want to call it obsolete if you want to, tend to get out of the city. So there is a sorting in terms, not only in terms of like the number of pieces of knowledge that you find in a city, but also the quality of these pieces, and that's what I'm addressing right now. I don't know if that answers your question.
So thank you, Professor. Does anyone has any other question?
Yes, hello. I would have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Can you introduce yourself?
Cool. Thanks. Hey, yeah, I'm Jacob. I'm organizing together with Igor the Urban and Regional Economics Group, and as I'm not as familiar with thanks. As I'm not as familiar as innovation with you are, so I'm wondering what is the definition of innovation you seem to have in that paper is it based purely on the patents? Because I was wondering how can you capture or how can you take into consideration low-tech innovations, social innovations, different forms of innovation? Can you actually do that with this data set, or other variables you're using to capture these things? And it seems to me that we need exactly these low-tech innovations and social innovations to perhaps overcome the spatial divide you were talking about, that to enhance the rural and non-urban areas. So I would love to hear your opinion on that too. Thanks.
Yeah, so thanks. Great question. I feel like there are two questions in your question. On the first point, we directly measure patents because this is the only. This is really already quite amazing that we are able to go back to 1790. We're very happy to be able to do that, and this is just the only proxy for invention that you have, going back to 1790 or going back for a long time period. That's the only proxy. Now, is it a good proxy or not? This is the most commonly used proxy for invention. And I'm really talking about invention. Sometimes in the talk, I use both innovation and invention interchangeably, but to be strict, this is a document, a patent is really a document that tells you something about how an invention has been invented with all the different steps. So it's a very specific type of invention. But if you go back in time, you have, invention related to a glass, to a ashtray, to all kind of invention that you might, or a chair that you might find actually low tech. That's absolutely that's something in a way that we have in data sets, because in 1790 the type of invention that you had were not by definition very, very complex. So we have them. They're not social innovation in the way probably you have in mind, but we have invention. We have documents that tell you something about different type of invention. Now, obviously, patents today are very high tech. There is also a very high cost, and they are also related to some specific technological areas that also expect economic returns, because a patent basically gives you the right to exclude others from the commercial exploitation of this invention. So it's a very, very specific type of invention, and I'm all yours on this one. That's also why to document this pattern between complexity and scaling, we also look at industries, occupation, and skills with jobs and stuff like that. So we are absolutely aware of this. This is what we do. This is what we document, and we don't look at other forms of invention or like social innovation, for instance. Now, on your second question, which is also, do we need that in a way to overcome this great, urban advantage of this great spatial divide that we see? We do need social invention, social innovation, but I would tend to believe, and I didn't do research on that, so it's just a belief from my own experience working in cities, working with policymakers, that also the social invention, they are not different in terms of the way they are created, the way they are generated from high-tech invention. You also need to exchange ideas. Bad ideas need to get killed. Good ideas need to, to be strengthened. And as someone that I love say all the time, ideas have sex with each other and they recombine in a new way. If you want to understand also this social innovation, I also believe that the way they are generated are exactly the same as high-tech innovation. Different scale maybe, but still, you might also need, and I would believe that you also need cities and proximity and large urban cores to produce them. And if you think about the fact also that cities tend to be also much more progressive than rural areas in terms of openness to new ideas, to new religious form, to new relationship formats, you really might understand that the way we create knowledge is very much dependent on proximity. and is not that different from high tech and low tech. So low tech or social innovation. So, but I would love to do some research on that, and I would love to read more. But I still think that cities might have this disadvantage also for social invention.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Jacob, for your question. Do you want to follow up? Because we have 2 more questions here. One from Federico. He asks, do you think that the cost of producing a technology not in the same place has been reduced over time? We have I'm going to read the 3 of them now. We have Andre has a second question. If I'm not wrong, in one time you said you developed a similar work for Brazil using Data Viva. Can you show some preliminary results for us? And thirdly, Rafael asked, the geographical proximity still play an important role in the innovation with the TICS approach. I think it's probably very related to Federico's questions. So,
okay. Again, on Federico's question, I'm not entirely sure that what you mean by the cost of producing a technology not in the same place. So that I'm not sure I understand. Not in the same place. What is the benchmark? What are we talking about? Let me try to have like a guess out of what's in your mind when you frame this question in this way. Let's say, for instance, in the Silicon Valley, you have an incredible high concentration of talents and companies and venture capital related to the software industry, for instance. Okay. Now, you will be maybe your question is it easier than in the past? Is easier now to produce softwares, for instance, right now here in Amsterdam, rather than in the Silicon Valley? I would say it's more difficult than in the past. More difficult, not only because maybe in the past what was relevant was the cost of moving goods or the cost of moving people. Okay, but right now what's very important is the cost of moving ideas. So if you want to come up with the new Google, okay, so the way Google, appeared in the tech space was very, very impressive. Sergey Brin and Larry Page were attending a workshop in Stanford about networks, and they use an idea of how to measure centrality in social networks, and they took this idea and they applied this idea to measuring centrality of website with hyperlink. So what was very important was to be close to the source of this idea, okay? And being away from this idea gives you a terrible disadvantage, because if you're next to these big ideas, once you apply this idea, then the competition is over. Because once we have a Google, we don't need another Google doing exactly the same. You can protect your algorithm. Google has a patent that basically protect this patent, and then it's over. So you're already losing. So the scaling effect, it's absolutely enormous now in this knowledge-based economy. It's all about accessing important ideas, relevant ideas, and then going to market. Once you're in the market and once you have a good idea, it's very difficult to catch up. Think about Amazon. We really live in a world of monopoly. It's like, different type of waves. Once you're on the wave, you're alone. You can really enjoy monopoly rent for a very, very long time. Think about Amazon, think about YouTube, think about Google. Once they get the idea, which is actually pretty simple, but once they get it, once they apply it right, it's over. The competition is over. So in that sense, to me, it's more difficult to produce an innovation that will have an impact if you're not in the place where all these ideas tend to gather and tend to be really used. So in that sense, that would be my answer to Federico. I think it's more difficult. Now, if you're talking about a low level of complexity, then I agree. If you talk about a low level of complexity, if you want to learn how to code, for instance, basic coding, super easy to learn basic coding on the internet. You don't even know to go to a class for basic coding. Now, the more complex you want to go, the more advanced you want to go, the closer you want to be the people that develop new coding techniques. And then there is need for geography. If you just want to learn basic coding, you can do it at home. That I agree. But for very complex type of knowledge, then you need geography. That would be my answer to Federico. Now we'll go to, sorry, okay, Data Viva. Very quickly, I think I had it somewhere here. Do you see my screen?
Yes, we do, Professor.
Right now you do, okay. Okay, that's for Data Viva. This one is for Data Viva. Here we go. Here we have average literacy and geographical concentration of industries. So that's for Brazilian industries. And we use average literacy, which is maybe not the best, but that's what we have. But basically, we also confirm this with Data Viva. So that was a very short snapshot here for you, for Andre. And I'm happy to follow up if you have more questions on that. Okay. And Rafael, okay, Rafael Stefani. Well, that's exact. So you point out to a very interesting question, which is, but hey, now that we have communication technologies and transportation costs falling apart, well, that should be easier. Okay, that should be easier to access knowledge at a distance. And this is basically that would be the intuition. Now, the paradox that you observe is that innovation concentrates more and more with each new technological wave in terms of communication or transportation technology, because the TIC are new modern technologies. But if you go back to the telegraph or other form of technological communication before, I mean, humans always tried to innovate, to communicate more efficiently, always, since the very first human. We invented technologies to communicate in a different way without having to be next to each other. But the funny thing is, if you take the arrow of time, the more we develop these communication technologies, the more we also concentrate in a few pockets in the world. So both go together. And to me, the reason is really about the fact that the more we communicate, the more we are able to share ideas and knowledge, the more we are able to come up with complex technologies. And these complex technologies, they really require this face-to-face interaction. Then we could probably chat for 2 hours or maybe 2 days on this question, because this is probably the most important question for me in my whole career. For the past 10 years, I've been trying to answer this question. Like, why do we see this paradox of this need of more geographical proximity despite technological progress? So, but that would be a short answer to you.
Professor Balland, thank you so much. I think we are just a little on time, which is great. And thank you so much for this amazing presentation. It was really, really interesting. We had a very high number of attendees, which made the discussion much more lively and interesting. And I'd like to thank you very much for accepting our invitation. In the name of Innovation Working Group, I also thank the the Urban and Economics Working Group for helping us organizing this webinar. Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you for Igor to helping organizing it as well.
Thank you. Let me just conclude by this then. Thank you so much, Danilo. Thank you so much, Igor. It was really great. I really enjoyed it tremendously. And thank you so much for your effort in building up this initiative. I wish you the best for the next webinar, and I will attend as well as much as possible.
Thank you so much, Igor.
Thank you, Danilo. Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much for this webinar. It was a great opportunity to hear you. And I'd like to invite everyone to keep watching the webinars from our webinar series, Innovation in a Regional Context. The next webinar will be